This is episode 352 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined by local attorney here in Albuquerque, Angelo Artuso, and he is somebody who has represented pro-liberty causes on a regular basis, including the Rio Grande Foundation. We can talk about that, but also is representing Los Alamos National Lab employees who do not want to get the vaccine under the vaccine mandate. And we'll talk about that. Welcome to the show, Angelo.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, thanks for taking time out of what I understand is a very busy schedule to talk about some of these issues, and I really appreciate it because you're not one of these big firms with all kinds of staff, and I know you guys pay by the hour too, so I totally sympathize with that. But before we get into some of these issues, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you wound up in New Mexico and being a pro-liberty lawyer.
Sure. I was born at Patrick Air Force Base in Florida. I lived there with my family, my parents, until I was 13 years old. We moved to Ohio for a year. My dad hated the weather in Ohio. He's originally from southern Italy, and he wrangled a transfer out here to Kirtland. I went to high school here, graduated from Highland High School in 1976, was fortunate enough to get an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy, graduated from there in 1980, did my 5 years of active duty service as a naval intelligence officer, and then after that sort of kicked around a bit for a couple of years, eventually ended up going to law school at night, married with 3 small kids, at least for the first 2 years, and then the third year my wife went up to Yale to do a graduate degree, so I spent my time commuting on the weekends between Baltimore and New Haven, Connecticut. Got my law degree from the University of Maryland, and we were looking to relocate back to New Mexico because our families lived here. And as I said, we had 3 small kids and could really use some free babysitting. So we moved back here. I was able to get a position with the Modrell Sperling law firm here in New Mexico, here in Albuquerque. I was with them for 20 years. Then I took a sabbatical to work on what we had hoped would be a revolutionary digital projector with a business partner of mine. We ended up pivoting in that small company to developing a really remarkable LED-based light. 2014, family responsibilities caused me to just become a passive investor in that pursuit. Meanwhile, I'd kept my license and I kept taking bits and pieces of cases and legal issues here and there. I basically have been a trial lawyer. It'll be 30 years in April. And the other part of my practice, for the most part, is advising small businesses, helping them to set themselves up as limited liability companies, helping them to raise money through private placement offerings, and helping them with their contracts and stuff. And most of that has been with respect to independent film production companies. I have always had a very deep attachment to the ideals of the American Revolution. I think that America, in my mind, is more of an idea than a place, necessarily. Things like the Green Berets' motto, De Oppresso Liber, to free from oppression, strikes me as kind of the mission statement, at least in my mind, of the United States, of America as an idea. I was the executive director of the Alaska Libertarian Party for a little over a year when we lived in the Anchorage area after I got out of the Navy. And I have always been interested. One of the reasons I became a lawyer was because I wanted to work on issues that, like the issues that so many people are facing today, issues involving restrictions and infringements of their constitutional rights, issues involving restrictions on liberty. And, as I heard the other day somebody I was talking to said, we're not called to win, we're called to fight. And so that's kind of the position I think most lawyers fighting on the side of liberty find themselves in the COVID environment, but we'll keep fighting.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that for sure. But the way that you came to be on this particular show, and despite us knowing each other and having worked together, even the Rio Grande Foundation with you, I got an email from just having the podcast. You have all these people pitching guests, and somebody was pitching a guest who was representing Los Alamos National Lab workers who are opposed to being mandated to take the vaccine, which is being imposed by President Biden. Rio Grande Foundation is agnostic on the vaccine. We don't have a problem with the vaccine itself, but we have strong concerns about government mandates to the effect that you have to take a vaccine. And sure enough, you're the person who came back to us, and I was like, well, we can certainly have a great conversation with Angelo. So here you are, and so let's talk about the particulars of this case to the extent that you can, because this is on its way through the legal system. So in federal court, you are representing how many employees?
8.
Okay.
And it's not just me. I was actually contacted by Thomas More Society, which is a nonprofit legal group that works on religious liberty issues throughout the country. And I have a couple of great lawyers, Tyler Brooks from North Carolina and Steve Crampton from Chicago, who have been working diligently on this case as well. Together, we have 8 Los Alamos National Labs employees who were all granted religious exemptions by their employer, but the only accommodation the employer will offer them is essentially twofold. If you have vacation time, use up your vacation time. When your vacation time is expired, you may be terminated. We will not guarantee that you have a job. If you're not terminated, you'll be placed on leave without pay indefinitely. Mm-hmm. And we could terminate you at any point during that process if we decide that we found someone else to fill your job who will go ahead and get the jab. What makes this case particularly egregious in my mind is that Los Alamos National Labs also granted medical exemptions to some employees, and they have provided accommodations to those employees. The law requires that if you grant a religious exemption, you have to engage in an interactive dialogue with the employee to determine what exemptions can be offered that will honor both their religious convictions and not impose an undue hardship on you as the employer. Well, they did engage in an interactive dialogue with the medically exempt employees, and those employees are still working. They're still getting paid. They still have their benefits. But if you got a religious exemption, if you are a religious person, we don't need you at Los Alamos. You can use up your vacation time, can't use any of your sick leave, and once you get to the end of vacation, we can either fire you or put you on leave without pay indefinitely. And our lawsuit alleges, and I think quite correctly, that that is just a per se infringement on the right to the free exercise of religion. The labs have conceded that these people have a sincere religious belief, but is refusing to do anything to work with them.
All right. Well, let's set a few grounds parameters here. First and foremost, approximately by your estimation, what percentage or how many employees of Los Alamos are not vaccinated?
I'm going to give you a best estimate.
Yeah,
there was an article in the Los Alamos newspaper that talked about something like 182 employees who decided to quit rather than be vaccinated, and 153 employees granted religious exemptions. So if you add those two together, you get 335.
Out of a workforce
of over 10,000.
Okay. So it's a pretty small number.
Yes.
And that's not surprising, but these are, when you hear tales of people who don't want to get vaccinated, it's often portrayed as ignorant hillbilly, trailer park dwelling Trump voters. Obviously, people working at Los Alamos National Lab are among the brightest among us, for sure. So these are people. Do you believe that many of them, most of them, some of them have had coronavirus and just feel like natural immunity is the thing that they should have against the virus, or is there more of just a philosophical, I'm not getting this thing no matter what?
It depends on the person. In our group of plaintiffs, there are several who did have COVID, survived COVID, have natural immunity, provided the labs with antibody testing that they paid for themselves to show that they had natural immunity, and requested a medical exemption. All medical exemptions based on natural immunity, to the best of my knowledge, have been denied by Los Alamos National Labs. But the part of the reason behind the push for those medical exemptions is studies tend to indicate that people who have had COVID and have natural immunity do have a small but not unrealistic chance of a hyperimmune response if they receive the vaccine. And that hyperimmune response can lead to some very serious lifelong consequences. And so, from my perspective, the question devolves into who or how does anyone else have the right to tell you that you have to take that risk? Now, as I said, all of the employees that I represent, or that me and the Thomas More Society represent, have been granted religious exemptions. And those basically fall into two categories that are not mutually exclusive. Some overlap, some don't. Some of the employees take the position that their religious faith and their religious convictions teach them that their body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and they don't engage in any activity involving taking in things to their body which they consider contrary or potentially contrary to their health, or that counter their or act as a sort of a denial of their belief that God will keep them healthy. Some of the folks I represent take no vaccines, have opted their kids out of vaccines, and really are very careful about the medical treatment that they allow themselves. Some of the other employees take the position that their religious faith teaches them and guides them into being pro-life, and are very adamant about not taking anything that was developed using aborted fetal stem cell and tissue. And at least two of the three vaccines approved for emergency use in the United States were either developed, tested, or manufactured using aborted fetal stem cell lines. And so for some of those employees, that's enough to say this is contrary to my religious convictions and belief. For others, they not only look at the aborted fetal stem cell line issue, but also say my body is a temple for the Holy Spirit. So those are the bases for the religious exemptions that I've seen, at least expressed in the people that I am dealing with.
Okay. And the Biden administration has imposed this particular mandate. This is through the government contractor mandate, as I understand it, because the relationship, and you can clarify this, National Lab, the National Lab is not a government agency per se. It's under the Department of Energy. It's largely funded by the government, but it is run through a contractor. And this is where you've got people like, or companies like Southwest Airlines, which I guess their contracts primarily through the mail. I don't know how integral those contracts are to companies like Southwest. But when it comes to Los Alamos, there is no if, and, or but about it. They are under federal purview via the contractor component of this thing.
Well, and we argued the position, take the position in our pleadings that have been filed with the court, that despite their protestations to the contrary, they are what would be legally defined to be a government actor. And the reason that's important is that government actors are not allowed to violate your constitutional rights to free exercise of religion or to equal protection under the law, the First Amendment, 14th Amendment in this particular instance. And we have argued, I think, convincingly that they are a government actor. Triad National Security LLC is the company which won the contract in 2018 to manage the labs. Triad has three co-equal members: the University of California Regents, which is a state entity, the Texas A&M University System, which is a state entity, and Battelle Memorial Institute, which is a private actor. So two of the three members that control the company are state entities to begin with. Los Alamos National Labs, as you can imagine, is heavily regulated by the federal government. There are all manners of statutes, regulations, and other requirements that they have to meet. Every activity is reviewed by the federal government on a regular basis, and in fact, their fees are increased based on the grade they receive from the federal government. In 2020, at the height of the COVID stuff, beginning in January of 2021, it was reported, for example, that 85% of the workforce worked remotely from home, most of them. And yet in 2020, the immediate 12 months before, Los Alamos National Labs efforts, or Triad's efforts at the labs, were rated very good by the National Nuclear Security Administration, a division of the Department of Energy, and they were given a $10 million bonus, a performance fee, for having done very good, even though 85% of their workforce is not on site. So in addition to that, as you
hold on, I take it that might be an argument in your pleading, saying that these people should be accommodated, if you will, like Americans with Disabilities Act or religious exemption, whatever, that if you don't want them on site because of their non-vaccinated status, that they should be able to work remotely.
In fact, several of them have worked very successfully remotely since the spring of 2020, when the protocols were first introduced. And those that haven't have had no problem being masked or social distancing or being periodically tested.
All right. Well, as just an outsider, I've always thought that the idea of people working at those labs remotely, one of the issues was that, using the internet, which we all know, there's hacks and all these kinds of things. We're not just talking about, FedEx or some big company, the secrets of Coke and how you make it being shipped around on the internet. But these are America's top secrets of nuclear technology and how we build these bombs. Presumably, they've got the technology that you can send that information or related information over the internet, and it works out. And there's not been, we've been in this COVID situation for over a year and a half, and nothing has happened. So something's working out.
Well, yes, and in fact, all of the email extensions at Los Alamos National Labs, going back to the government actor issue, are at LANL.gov. Not Triad or Triad National Security or TNS.com, LANL.gov, because of that very reason. And frankly, one of the arguments I made last Friday in front of the court was I cannot think of a single private actor or company which is given unfettered access to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are something that are committed to the unique province of the government. And for the government, or for Triad, to take the position that we're not a government actor, and therefore we don't have to do the things that government has to do, is simply a charade.
Okay, well, I guess we talked before the conversation got recorded. You personally are extremely busy, but talk a little bit about this Thomas More nonprofit law firm. There's a lot of them. We're being represented by the Goldwater Institute, for example, which is another think tank with a legal arm. A lot of the state think tanks have legal arms. These people have a legal arm. Would you recommend, and this is totally open for your interpretation, would you recommend that if people who maybe represent or being impacted by these kinds of requirements in their jobs, should they talk to somebody like Thomas More? Are they taking more cases, more people? Talk about that.
Yes, I think that they should talk to someone like Thomas More Society or Alliance Defending Freedom. ADF is another one that has a focus on, particularly on religious liberty.
How do they find out about them?
You can basically just Google online, I mean, you can just search online.
Okay.
They'll pop right up, and there'll be contact information on there about, either by email or a phone number or something, and you get a hold
Thomas
of them.
More Society.
Thomas More Society.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where are they based out of? Just so
Chicago.
Chicago. Okay. Now, we obviously have another national nuclear lab here in New Mexico in Sandia. I know I've talked to some employees have expressed concern. They're involved in a separate lawsuit or?
I haven't seen one, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Okay.
I haven't actually looked for one. I've been way too busy
understand.
doing this one, but I don't know.
Okay.
I did find it somewhat interesting that for the first time, at least in my knowledge, Los Alamos National Labs has put up a billboard on Eubank, just outside essentially a few blocks north of the Sandia National Labs gate, advertising for employees. So I don't know if the mandates are causing national labs to try and poach from each other or what's going on, but I don't ever remember seeing get a job at LANL billboard in Albuquerque before.
Fascinating. Okay. And one nuance there, you mentioned the management or the contract through two different state actors, one being California, one being Texas. Now, we know that California, they're boosters and the whole 9 yards. They would vax me harder, whatever it is. And Texas, they've actually passed a law in opposition to mandates. Is that a legal issue in your case, or how do you see that?
It hasn't been brought up yet, but it
Okay.
certainly provides a very interesting avenue for doing some exploration.
Okay.
And I really can't say much more than that,
Fair
other
enough.
than we're aware of Texas's stand, and we're taking a look at how or whether that might be of assistance in terms of preserving the liberty of these folks.
All right. Well, you said you had a hearing recently, and can you talk about the process here as you see it playing out? You're in federal court, so where's this whole situation heading?
Yes, we filed a complaint asking for several things, but one of the things we asked for is what's known as injunctive relief, and there are basically three types of injunctions. The first is a TRO, or a temporary restraining order. Those can be issued without even having a hearing in front of a judge. They can be issued what's known as ex parte, without talking to the side being enjoined. Usually TROs are temporary, 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that. And they are designed simply to preserve the status quo between the parties until the court can actually schedule a hearing and give everybody time to file their briefs. So the next step in injunctive relief is what's called a preliminary injunction. Preliminary injunction is usually granted for a much longer period of time. It will frequently last until the end of the case. At that point in time, the judge will decide whether or not to issue a permanent injunction. Preliminary injunctions are subject to tweaking and changes during their life. So the hearing last week in front of the judge was for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. She decided to hear both of those things together. And we argued for about 2.5 hours on Friday from 9 to 11:30. She has taken them sort of under advisement. The labs wanted to do a response brief to, or actually a reply brief to a motion that they had filed to compel the employees to go to arbitration, and she allowed them to do that, and they have to file it by Friday. Once she gets that, she'll make a decision whether she'll send everybody to arbitration, whether she'll grant a TRO and have further hearings on an injunction, or whether she'll just issue a preliminary injunction. Obviously, we hope that she just issues a preliminary injunction and that she prohibits the labs from placing our clients and similarly situated people with religious exemptions on leave without pay, allows them to go back to work, earn money, get their benefits, and stop the, there's an awful lot of emotional and psychological damage, if you can imagine, just the uncertainty anyone faces when they have an uncertain financial future. Some of these plaintiffs have worked at the labs for over 20 years. Some of them are lifelong residents of northern New Mexico where jobs don't fall out of the sky. and they have families. Some of them have young kids, and they're looking at maybe having to put their house up for sale. The kids are 10, 11, 13, something like that. They kind of know what's going on. They're worried. Am I going to have to move? Or go to school? Miss my friends? What are we going to be okay? Are we going to lose our house? There's a lot of that sort of stuff going on as a result of Los Alamos National Labs policies, which frankly, in my opinion, are completely unnecessary and part of the damage that we're asking the court to do something about in this case. Hopefully she'll issue that preliminary injunction until we can get this sorted out.
So at this point, you haven't had a hearing on the overall merits of the case, so
Correct.
to speak, just a injunctive relief kind of situation. And but that's critical stuff.
And if the injunction isn't granted, it doesn't mean the case goes away, because we would still have our claims for infringement of constitutional rights. We still have our claims under Title VII for discrimination on the part of an employer on the basis of religion. We still have our claims under the Americans with Disabilities Act for the employees that have natural immunity being forced to take this vaccine or constructively discharged by being placed on leave without pay. So all of those claims will continue, and then it's up to the clients and the lawyers and discussions with each other. If the injunctive relief isn't issued, do we want to continue? And in all likelihood, my vote would be yes, because I don't think that this sort of behavior should be encouraged either in a government actor or any other one who seems to have the power to tell people how to live their lives and what to do with themselves.
Now, I want to transition, kind of pull the lens back out a little bit here. But one of the things I've often wondered is, there's been Supreme Court decisions over the years, going back 100 years, on vaccine mandates, usually passed through the state legislature, signed by the governor, and then upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Has there ever been, to your knowledge, a mandate to get any health procedure done by individuals coming from the President of the United States acting alone without congressional approval? Is that,
No.
Are we we're near new territory there, right?
Yes. My take on the actions by the executive branch are that an executive order is a directive to executive branch employees only. It is not law. Okay. Now, he can direct OSHA, for example, to put together a regulation, supposedly, that requires individual employers who more than 100 employees to require their employees be vaccinated. That'll be challenged. Whether or not the courts will uphold it will remain to be seen. But OSHA, one of the problems I think they have is they're not following the Administrative Procedures Act. They are not publishing the regulation for public comment. They are not going through the steps that you need to go through. If they issue a regulation, it's going to be on an emergency basis. And then there are remedies and things that have to happen once that emergency regulation has been issued. But it'll be challenged. So the fact that the president issued an executive order, and isn't it interesting, Los Alamos and the Triad takes the position that they're not a government actor. But they issued their vaccine mandate on the same day that President Biden announced that the Comirnaty vaccine by Pfizer had been approved by the FDA for use. The Comirnaty vaccine, by the way, is not available in the United States. But they're still using their emergency use authorization vaccine only. But on that same day, he also urged all private employers to require their employees to get vaccinated. And on that day, August 23rd, the director of Los Alamos National Labs issued the lab's vaccine mandate. But they're not a government actor.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a Rubicon, obviously, for the federal government. And, if you want to comment on this, just personally, it illustrates not just that we've entered a new paradigm from a state level perspective, because obviously, and I want to talk about New Mexico and our governor, but obviously she's taken it upon herself to largely govern, especially in this area, all by herself. Now, Biden doesn't have any specific emergency policies that he has invoked, to my knowledge, that allow him to act any differently. It just shows you how the imperial presidency has continued to grow, and despite Trump being rhetorically somebody who a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, and sometimes Trump's own statements gave the impression that he was some kind of tin pot dictator. The reality is that federal authority has been grown in an unprecedented way under Biden, not so much under President Trump. So you can just nod your head and agree. That's great.
Yep, I do.
And let's talk about the judiciary then. And this is a federal case, so it's very important to clarify that you're not dealing with New Mexico law, which only makes sense because you're dealing with the federal mandate and federal lab. But in general, it seems like federal judges, state judges, all across the country, by and large, with a few very notable exceptions, have been very willing to go along with government power. Now, again, we have emergency laws in New Mexico. Of course, there was a Supreme Court case going back 100 years that said that the legislature of, I believe, Massachusetts can have a vaccine, can require people to get vaccinated. There is some legal authority out there going back a very long time to mandate vaccines, but we're in pretty uncharted territory when it comes to a lot of these policies. So just talk about the legal wrangling that's gone on over the last year and a half plus, and where you think that puts the judiciary as an institution.
Well, there's the leading case that the forces of oppression, as I will call them, rely on in saying, I can make you take this shot, is Jacobson v. Massachusetts. It was decided in 1905 by the U.S. Supreme Court. In that case, Mr. Jacobson refused to take a smallpox vaccine that was being mandated by the state of Massachusetts. If you refused to take the vaccine, you were fined $5, which in today's money I saw somewhere would be like $185. But
okay. And what was the death rate from smallpox back in those days?
I don't know.
Okay.
I would have to look.
We're talking definitely survival was below 99.7 or 98.
Yes. Yes. Here's the problem in my mind with Jacobson v. Massachusetts. It was decided before the Bill of Rights of the federal Constitution started being applied to state actions under the 14th Amendment, number one.
Okay.
Number two, it was applied at a time when the science of things like vaccination and epidemiology and virology was much less developed than it is today. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of competing studies related to the whole COVID thing, which would say, not so fast, Governor, not so fast, Mr. President. The science, if you look at not just your science, but you actually look at the science, would say that we are not nearly as certain as you would pretend to be about this entire issue. But to me, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, in many respects, is not any different than the Dred Scott decision. That was the law of the land. Well, guess what? The law changes. And what needs to happen, especially in light, in my mind, of what I consider to just be flat-out abuses of power, particularly by executive branches around the country, is that there needs to be a real reflection and look at, do we want to allow executives to simply declare, and in essence, what's happened in New Mexico, I was part of the Romero case, which was a judge down in Carlsbad who issued a TRO against the public health orders regarding occupancy in restaurants. That lasted, we were so happy, that lasted for about an hour. And then the state removed the case from the judge in Carlsbad, went up to the state Supreme Court. which issued a writ of mandamus after arguments and stuff within about 30 or 40 days. First off, they stayed enforcement of the TRO, and then they had arguments, and within about 30 to 40 days, they issued a writ of mandamus saying that the TRO was null and void, and he couldn't do what he had done. The basis of that case, and I'm gonna probably
This is the Carlsbad case?
This is the
Okay.
Carlsbad
Right.
case. Essentially, what the New Mexico Supreme Court ended up ruling, it was 4-0, one of the justices recused themselves, was that so long, essentially, this is how I interpret it, so long as the executive branch says public health, there are no constitutional rights. If they say public health and can articulate any reason, whether that reason is supported by actual science, actual data, and actual facts, the judiciary in the state of New Mexico will take no action. You cannot. One of the things we challenged the public health orders on in the Carlsbad case was that they were arbitrary and capricious. We asked the state, produce all of the documents that you have referred to, relied on, or consulted in deciding that restaurants can't have indoor dining. Nothing. Not a single document. They produced reams and reams and reams of paper about how bad COVID was and why they needed to do something about COVID. But they could not produce anything that said definitively, at least at that time, that restaurants, indoor dining in restaurants, was a huge source of infection. And the Supreme Court for the state basically said, doesn't matter. They said public health.
Right.
It's a talisman,
Now
or a mantra.
We are talking about New Mexico's courts here, and your case, thankfully, is in the federal courts. But they, and I know you don't want to get on your high horse about the federal courts, and I respect that. But I think the next thing that we need to talk about in New Mexico law is that we're seeing these, and it used to be just rhetorical, but now you can see the legal framework being developed for guns, public health crisis.
Yes.
Global warming, public health crisis. And the framework is being constructed for that kind of tyranny, if you will, around those and other potential cases.
And it goes the other way. One of the arguments that I considered, and I was convinced by some of the attorneys I was working with not to make it, they thought it was too distracting. They thought it was a hot button issue. But in the Carlsbad case, one of the arguments I thought about making to the New Mexico Supreme Court, which had at the time 1 Republican and 4 Democrats on it, was under the current state of the law, what is to prevent some future New Mexico Secretary of Health from deciding that all of the studies which show significant negative consequences to women who undergo an abortion represents a public health crisis or a public health issue, and issue a public health order that simply says, under my authority as the Secretary of Public Health, no more abortions. It can go both ways. The problem is once you let the genie out of the lamp, stuffing them back in gets really hard. And I wanted to raise that argument because the other side of the government equation needs to understand that this is an issue that affects all sides. Once you've restricted the liberty of your opponent, it's only a matter of time before that beast turns on you and begins to restrict things that you consider important.
Right. Now, let's go back to the Supreme Court because I have 1905 was a unique era in American jurisprudence, if you will, and you can certainly elaborate if you want to, but it was a very, progressive era, which, the nice thing about progressives is that they're consistently wrong all throughout human history, going back to Woodrow Wilson, my least favorite and worst president in American history, in my opinion, although Joe Biden's really trying hard to achieve Woodrow Wilson-esque levels. But we can have that in another episode. Buck v. Bell. This is the case on, where Oliver Wendell Holmes, I believe, said 3 generations of idiots is enough. This is on what do they call it when they were making it so the women could not have
Forced
babies.
sterilization.
And that Massachusetts case that you talked about was used in Buck v. Bell as one of the one of the supporting cases. And I know that's extreme, but I mean, it just shows you how far we've come as a country in terms of protecting individual rights. And I don't want to necessarily go down that rat hole. We only have a few minutes, but I do want to talk about, shouldn't there be some consideration for laws passed by a state legislature as opposed to imposed by one person acting, even if that is the President of the United States, by themselves? We have these, I believe Wendell Holmes also said, laboratories of democracy, those kinds of things. Isn't that some kind of bulwark against these policies, or have we just abandoned any concept of Congress playing a useful role here in these policies? I mean, it'd be one thing if Congress passed a law saying national lab employees, federal contractors, over 100 employees, et cetera, you all have to get vaccinated. But they haven't even, to my knowledge, introduced such a law. So talk about that.
Well, the erosion of the checks and balances has been ongoing, in my mind, in some ways almost from the beginning, but it really took off. The anchor was severed by Abraham Lincoln, my least favorite president, who completely loosened the moorings of the Constitution and did things that prior to that time would not have ever been contemplated by any executive. Now, I know that's a controversial opinion, and I hope people don't tune out having heard my statement on that.
Well, if they're 40 minutes in and they tune out now, so be it. But that is a bold statement to make Lincoln your least favorite president.
Yes.
I will grant you that.
It has been, of course, it accelerated under Wilson and continued to accelerate under President Johnson. And over time, we have seen more and more of a drift toward oligarchy and less of a Republican form of government. The legislature can take back its power at any time. The problem is we have, a whole bunch of folks who don't seem to be united in a common cause of actually providing for a representative republic. Larry the Cable Guy had a great suggestion one time. He said, I think members of Congress should look like NASCAR drivers and have to wear the patches and logos of everybody who's contributed to their campaign or lobbied them for something. But regardless, yes, we are drifting into very dangerous territory. Whether or not we'll be able to reverse it remains to be seen. The legislatures, under the written constitutions of both the U.S. government and the states, are supposed to be where laws originate. There was an effort in the last legislative session here in New Mexico, I believe, to try and introduce some legislation which would have put some curves on the broad powers that the governor and the Secretary of Health took advantage of during the COVID crisis, but it didn't pass. Yeah. And it may be the sort of thing that needs to come up every legislative session until it does. I don't know, but we're approaching a rule by a small group, oligarchs, or by a single person, President Biden and Governor Lujan Grisham. And that's not a great place to be.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about two different tracks here, state and federal. Ben Shapiro, whose podcast I listen to, he frequently says that all Congress does nowadays is to pass massive spending bills through Washington, or not pass, as the case may be, hopefully, especially after the election results in Virginia. That should put the fear of God in everybody, not just Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. But here in New Mexico, of course, with Democrat control top down, I would hope that if the Republicans ever have both houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion, and they should be campaigning on this, that Bill 1 should be to put limits on executive power in an emergency and strictly define what an emergency may be, because, again, see that previous commentary about the abuse of those emergencies. Well, Angelo, any final thoughts before we go? I know there's plenty of other things we could talk about, but once you get into some of these this is a hot button issue. Abortion's important, but this one truly encompasses all of us in our day-to-day lives. And I appreciate you for heroically defending people who want to live their lives and preserve their livelihoods. And it's really great. So any information you want to share as a final note?
Just this thought, and it's been something that's been bothering me since the beginning of the whole COVID issue. I understand the desire on the part of the vast majority of people to just not make waves, to sort of go along to get along and hope that they can avoid any real negative impact. But I would encourage people to step back and think, what sort of world are you leaving for your children and your grandchildren? If you are not willing to step up now to oppose this sort of tyranny, frankly, tyranny, you have to wear a mask. You cannot keep your business open. You have to take an unproven drug, put it in your body. We don't know what the long-term effects are. Trust us, we're with the government. If you're not willing to stand up now, will you ever be willing to stand up? And if you don't stand up now, what sort of a future are you bequeathing to your children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren? Now is the time. It can be peaceful. We as the people have the ability. We used to have a saying back at the Naval Academy, they can't fry us all, meaning they can't punish all of us. If enough New Mexicans say, you know what, enough with this mask nonsense, I'm not wearing one, there is nothing the government can do about it. Yeah. If enough businesses say, enough of this lockdown nonsense, we're staying open, there's nothing they can do about it. And it's the same with the vaccine. So your rights are individual rights. That means you have an individual responsibility to try and protect them. Those are my final thoughts. All right.
Well said. Leave it to the attorney to give the fiery speech, and I appreciate that. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.